My name is Kendra. I am 34 years old, and my husband thought I was just a boring numbers girl who would blindly carry his illegal contraband across international borders. He actually thought he could slip a locked steel case into my suitcase at 3 in the morning and I would not notice. So I quietly slipped it into his mistress's designer tote bag instead. When the alarms went off at the JFK security checkpoint, the color drained from his face so fast he looked like a ghost. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic partner who severely underestimated your intelligence. The fluorescent lights of JFK Airport buzzed overhead as the Friday morning rush pressed in around us. Trent's fingers dug into my upper arm, his grip tight enough to bruise through my heavy trench coat. "Move faster, Kendra. You are dragging your feet on purpose," he hissed, glancing nervously toward the priority lane. We were heading to London for what he claimed was a crucial wealth management conference. During the entire ride to the airport, Trent had berated me for packing too slowly. He kept tapping his expensive watch, complaining that my lack of urgency was exactly why I would never succeed in the high-stakes corporate world. Over in the first-class lane, Sienna stood adjusting her silk scarf. She was 27, Trent's executive assistant, and supposedly traveling with us for corporate support. She caught Trent's eye and offered a flirtatious pout, completely ignoring the fact that his wife of 7 years was standing less than 10 feet away. "I am moving as fast as the line allows, Trent," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Maybe if I was not hauling your heavy business samples in my carry-on bag, I could keep up with your eager executive assistant." Trent scoffed, releasing my arm to run a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked me up and down with that familiar expression of total disdain. "We talked about this, Kendra. Your luggage is generic. It is boring. You are boring. TSA never searches boring women in practical shoes. My bags get flagged all the time because I carry high-end electronics and wear expensive watches. Just do your part for once instead of complaining." Boring. That was his absolute favorite word for me. A forensic accountant who spent her days analyzing corporate fraud for a global firm was simply too dull for a hotshot wealth management vice president. He loved my stable six-figure income when he wanted to finance his expensive golf club memberships and luxury car leases. However, he openly despised my practical nature when it came to his flashy, arrogant lifestyle. His mother, Beatrice, had always reinforced this toxic dynamic. She constantly reminded me that my working-class background made me an embarrassing fit for their prestigious, wealthy family image. We finally reached the conveyor belt. I placed my sensible black suitcase into the gray plastic bin. In the adjacent lane, Sienna hoisted her oversized designer tote onto the belt with a dramatic sigh. She flashed a brilliant practice smile at the TSA agent, clearly expecting her beauty to buy her a quick pass through security. I watched the monitor intently as her bag rolled into the dark X-ray tunnel. Suddenly, the conveyor belt jerked to a violent halt. A harsh electronic alarm blared across the checkpoint, cutting sharply through the usual terminal noise. The TSA agent, staring at the monitor, shouted a code word and immediately signaled to a supervisor. Within seconds, 3 armed security officers swarmed the end of the belt, isolating Sienna's expensive designer bag. Trent froze in his tracks. The blood instantly vanished from his face, leaving his normally tan complexion a sickly shade of gray. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, his voice dropping to a frantic guttural whisper. "Kendra, how exactly did you pack my bag? Did you accidentally put my medication lockbox into Sienna's tote when you were moving the client files?" I looked him dead in the eye, my expression entirely blank, savoring the absolute panic radiating from him. "You mean the heavy steel lockbox you secretly stuffed deep into the lining of my suitcase at 3 in the morning while you thought I was asleep?" "No, Trent. I did not do it accidentally. I deliberately transferred it to your mistress's bag before we left the house." His jaw dropped open. "Mistress, you are insane. She is my assistant, and that was my blood pressure medication. You have ruined my trip." I let out a sharp, cold laugh that made him flinch. Blood pressure medication does not require a biometric lock and lead lining, Trent. And executive assistants do not text their bosses at midnight asking if the boring wife suspects anything about the hidden Dubai accounts. I am a forensic accountant. Finding hidden assets, tracing stolen money, and uncovering lies is literally my profession. You really thought I would blindly carry a locked steel case through international customs for you without checking what was inside. Before Trent could formulate another pathetic lie, the TSA supervisor called out with authority, "Ma'am, step aside right now." He was addressing a terrified Sienna who was backing away from her own luggage with her hands raised in the air. The supervisor used a heavy metal override tool to pop open the steel lockbox they had pulled from the depths of her tote bag. The metal lid flipped back, catching the harsh airport lighting. It was not medication. It was dozens of raw, uncut diamonds spilling out across a bed of black velvet. Beside the sparkling stones lay a folded sheet of official paper. The supervisor held it up with gloved hands, examining it closely. It was a highly detailed falsified customs declaration form. From where I stood, I could clearly see my own name printed at the top, complete with a painstakingly forged copy of my signature at the bottom. Sienna began screaming hysterically, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "That is not mine. I have never seen that before in my entire life. He gave it to me. Trent gave me the bag to carry." Trent panicked entirely. His carefully crafted, arrogant facade shattered into a million pieces. Realizing his entire life was about to collapse, he lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. He screamed at the top of his lungs for the entire terminal to hear. "She put that there. My wife is trying to frame us. Arrest her right now. Arrest my wife." The sterile white walls of the Customs and Border Protection interrogation room felt like a freezer. Two armed federal agents stood silently by the heavy steel door, their expressions unreadable. Trent paced the length of the cramped space, pulling aggressively at the collar of his bespoke Italian suit, as if the fabric were suddenly choking him. Across the metal table, Sienna sobbed into her hands, her carefully applied makeup running down her face in dark, jagged lines. I sat perfectly still in the molded plastic chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. I simply watched the two of them unravel. An older CBP agent with sharp, observant eyes walked into the room carrying the steel lockbox inside a clear evidence bag. He set it on the center of the table with a heavy, resounding thud. Before the agent could even open his mouth to ask a single question, Trent launched into his practiced corporate defense. He pointed a manicured finger directly at Sienna, entirely willing to destroy her to save himself. "Listen to me," Trent demanded, his voice echoing harshly off the concrete walls. "I am a vice president of wealth management at a top-tier investment firm. I have a pristine record and powerful connections. This woman is merely my executive assistant, and she is clearly experiencing a severe psychological breakdown. She has been inappropriately obsessed with me for months. She must have stolen my personal lockbox from my home and stuffed it into her own bag in a deranged attempt to frame my innocent wife." Sienna abruptly stopped crying. Her head snapped up and her tear-stained face contorted into an expression of pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed her hands onto the metal table, rising to her feet so quickly her chair tipped over backward. "You lying coward!" Sienna screamed, her voice piercing the tense silence of the small room. "You told me you loved me. You told me we were moving to Dubai together the second you dumped your boring dead weight of a wife." Trent darted a frantic, terrified look toward the federal agents. "Do not listen to a word she says," he pleaded, sweating profusely now. "She is completely delusional. She needs a psychiatric hold, not an interrogation." "Delusional!" Sienna shrieked, taking a threatening step toward him before an agent placed a firm hand on her shoulder to hold her back. "I have been sleeping with you for an entire year. I know all about the secret weekend trips to the Hamptons you paid for using stolen client expense accounts. I know about the offshore shell companies you brag about after 3 drinks. You personally handed me that tote bag this morning and swore it just had some extra corporate gifts inside for the conference. You set me up to take the fall." Trent practically lunged across the room, denying everything in a rapid, chaotic string of words. He insisted Sienna was just a disgruntled employee trying to extort him for a payday, spinning a web of lies that sounded pathetic even to his own ears. Seeing that the agents were entirely unmoved by his performance, he turned to me, his eyes pleading for backup. "Tell them, Kendra. Tell them she is crazy. Tell them I am an honest man who would never do something like this." The CBP agent looked at Trent, then at the hysterical Sienna before turning his calm, assessing gaze directly to me. "Ma'am, you have been remarkably quiet since you were brought in. The name on the forged customs declaration form we found with the diamonds matches your passport perfectly. Do you have a statement you would like to make for the official record?" I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I reached into my sensible practical carry-on bag and pulled out my iPad. I unlocked the screen and placed it flat on the cold metal table, rotating it so the federal agent had a perfect unobstructed view. "I am a forensic accountant," I said smoothly, keeping my tone strictly professional. "My entire career revolves around finding hidden assets, tracking illicit funds, and exposing corporate liars. I do not rely on emotions, and I certainly do not rely on hearsay. I rely exclusively on hard data. Last month, I noticed several alarming discrepancies in our household accounts, so I took the liberty of installing a hidden high-definition security camera in the walk-in closet of our primary residence." I tapped the play button on the glass screen. The video quality was crystal clear, complete with a bright red timestamp in the corner reading 3:14 in the morning. The footage showed our dimly lit closet. Trent walked into the frame wearing a pair of blue latex surgical gloves. He was holding the exact steel lockbox that now sat in the evidence bag on the table. The federal agent leaned in closer, watching intently, as the digital version of Trent unzipped my generic black suitcase. The video clearly showed him lifting a stack of my neatly folded sweaters, placing the heavy steel box at the very bottom, and burying it. Finally, the camera captured him pulling a folded customs declaration form from his jacket pocket, forging my name with practiced precision, and sliding it into the suitcase zipper pouch. The interrogation room went dead silent. The only sound was the faint rhythmic hum of the air conditioning vent overhead. Sienna let out a breathless, stunned gasp. Trent looked exactly like a man who had just been struck by lightning. "That is fake," Trent stammered, stumbling backward until his spine hit the concrete wall. "That is manipulated video footage. She is a tech expert. She doctored that video to ruin my career because she is deeply jealous of my success." The CBP agent did not even blink at Trent's desperate, flailing excuses. He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a jeweler's magnifying loupe. He picked up one of the raw, uncut diamonds from the lockbox and held it up to the harsh fluorescent light, turning it slowly between his gloved fingers. He then pulled a small, encrypted tablet from his duty belt and cross-referenced the data on his screen. "You can save the corporate spin. Mr. Trent," the agent said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "These stones are not just random smuggled goods, they are laser-inscribed. We have been tracking these specific serial numbers for 6 months. They are directly linked to a massive cartel money laundering operation that routes illicit funds through the wealth management division of your exact investment firm." Trent's knees immediately buckled. He slid down the wall, his expensive suit crumpling as he hit the floor. The arrogance that had defined his entire personality was instantly erased, replaced by the terrifying realization that his glamorous life was permanently over. "You are under arrest for international smuggling conspiracy to commit fraud and federal money laundering." The agent continued, signaling to the officers standing by the door. The sharp metallic sound of heavy handcuffs clicking open filled the room. Trent thrashed against the agents as they hauled him to his feet and pulled his arms forcefully behind his back. He looked at me with wild, panicked eyes. "Kendra, please. Call my mother. Call Beatrice right now. Tell her to get the firm's best defense lawyers. Tell her I am innocent. You are my wife, you have to help me." I stood up from the plastic chair and casually smoothed out the wrinkles in my trench coat. I picked up my iPad, slipped it back into my bag, and looked down at the man who had spent 7 years treating me like a boring, inferior subordinate. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Trent," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "I have a flight to catch. Have a wonderful time explaining your heavy business samples to the federal prosecutor." I turned on my heel, grabbed the handle of my practical suitcase, and walked out of the interrogation room. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me, completely cutting off his frantic, desperate screams. The rideshare dropped me off at the end of my quiet suburban street. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the manicured lawns, a stark contrast to the sterile, chaotic interrogation room I had just left behind at JFK. I dragged my practical black suitcase up the sidewalk, relishing the crisp, cold air. My husband was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, and for the first time in 7 years, I could finally breathe. That peace vanished the second I turned the corner to my house. A sleek, silver Mercedes SUV was parked horizontally across the bottom of my driveway, completely blocking my path to the front door. Two women stood rigidly by the front bumper. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, wearing her signature pearl necklace, and an expression of absolute unhinged fury. Beside her stood Paige Trent's younger sister, furiously tapping on her designer smartphone with her perfectly manicured nails. The moment my sensible shoes crunched on the driveway gravel, Beatrice's head snapped toward me. She did not say a word. She marched across the concrete with terrifying speed, raised her right hand, and struck me hard across the face. The slap echoed loudly in the quiet neighborhood. The sharp sting radiated across my left cheek, and a warm drop of metallic blood pooled at the corner of my mouth, from where my teeth caught my inner lip. I did not stumble. I did not raise my hand to touch the injury. I simply stood my ground, my grip tightening around the handle of my suitcase, staring directly into Beatrice's manic eyes. "You vicious, calculating little rat," Beatrice screamed, completely abandoning her polished country club persona. Her chest heaved as she pointed a shaking finger an inch from my nose. "Trent just used his one phone call from a federal detention center. He told us exactly what you did. You planted those diamonds in Sienna's bag. You set up my son to take the fall for a cartel." Paige shoved her phone into her expensive handbag and stepped up beside her mother, crossing her arms with a look of supreme entitlement. "You are going to fix this right now," Kendra Page demanded, her voice shrill and grating. "You are going to pick up your phone, dial the federal agents who arrested my brother, and you are going to confess. You will tell them you smuggled those diamonds and framed Trent because you were a jealous, hysterical wife." I looked at Paige, genuinely astounded by the sheer audacity of her demand. "You want me to falsely confess to international smuggling and federal money laundering just to save Trent? Why not?" Paige shot back, scoffing, as if I had just asked a painfully stupid question. "Trent is a vice president of wealth management. He manages portfolios for the most important families in this state. He has an image to maintain. He has a future. You are just a glorified calculator. You sit in a boring cubicle and look at spreadsheets all day. You have zero reputation to protect and absolutely nothing to lose. Taking the fall is the least you can do to protect this family name." Beatrice sneered, stepping closer, her expensive perfume clashing with the toxic venom spilling from her mouth. "Paige is entirely right. You owe my son your freedom and your comfortable life. Do not think for 1 second I ever forgot where you came from, Kendra. You were raised in a cramped rental apartment by parents who worked themselves to the bone for minimum wage. You wore discount clothes and drove a rusted car until the day Trent found you. He rescued you from a life of absolute mediocrity. He married you out of pity because your blue-collar trash family could never give you the life he provided. You are nothing without the status he gave you. Now it is time to repay your debt. You will call the authorities, take the blame, and go to prison where you belong." I stood completely motionless, letting their insults wash over me. For 7 years, I had bitten my tongue while Beatrice mocked my upbringing. I had smiled politely while Paige belittled my career as boring and tedious. They truly believed I was a mindless drone, a submissive peasant lucky to be allowed at their dinner table. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they never bothered to understand what I actually did for a living. I slowly raised my hand and wiped the smear of blood from my bottom lip. I looked at the red stain on my thumb, then shifted my gaze back to my mother-in-law. The cold, unwavering deadness in my eyes finally made Beatrice take a hesitant half-step backward. "You both seem to have a fundamental misunderstanding of my profession," I said, my voice eerily calm and meticulously even. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute certainty in my tone made Paige stop fidgeting. I unzipped the front pocket of my suitcase and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen, navigated to my secure corporate email application, and opened the message that had arrived 20 minutes ago. I held the glowing screen up inches from Beatrice's face. "Read it carefully," I instructed. Beatrice squinted at the screen, her eyes darting across the bold official letterhead. I am not a glorified calculator, Beatrice. I am a senior forensic accountant. I specialize in dismantling corporate fraud and tracking laundered money through complex shell companies. I watched the color slowly drain from Beatrice's face as she read the words on the screen. Paige leaned over her mother's shoulder, her brow furrowing in confusion as she tried to comprehend the dense legal text. That email, I continued, my voice sharp as a scalpel, is a direct notification from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Following the discovery of those cartel diamonds at the airport this morning, the SEC has officially launched a massive joint agency investigation into Trent's investment firm. And because of my specific expertise in untangling these exact types of financial crimes, my firm has been retained to lead the audit. I have just been granted full, unrestricted federal clearance to tear apart every single transaction your golden boy son has made over the last 5 years. Paige gasped, stumbling back against the hood of her Mercedes. Beatrice opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch was suddenly rendered entirely speechless, her hands trembling at her sides. So, no, Paige, I will not be calling the FBI to confess, I said, sliding my phone back into my pocket. And Beatrice, I strongly suggest you get your vehicle off my driveway within the next 60 seconds. Because if you do not, I will not just audit Trent's corporate accounts. I will request a federal subpoena to audit those hidden offshore trusts in the Cayman Islands that you use to dodge your property taxes. I gripped the handle of my suitcase, stepping directly toward them. Get off my driveway right now! The heavy oak front door of our suburban home slammed shut with a force that rattled the expensive artwork on the walls. Trent stood in the foyer, looking like a shattered version of a magazine cover model. His bespoke suit was severely wrinkled from his brief stay in a federal holding cell, and his silk tie hung loosely around his neck. Despite the physical toll of his arrest, his posture radiated pure, unadulterated arrogance. He had just posted a $1 million cash bail courtesy of his mother Beatrice, and he walked into the house completely convinced he had beaten the system. I remained standing in the kitchen, casually leaning against the cold marble of the center island. I watched him march straight to the wet bar, grab a crystal tumbler, and pour himself a generous measure of scotch. His hands were shaking slightly, but his face was twisted into a cruel, triumphant sneer. He took a long swallow, slammed the glass down, and turned his predatory gaze toward me. You really thought you had me, Kendra? He barked, his voice echoing loudly in the open concept living space. You actually believed you could outsmart me and lock me away. Do you have any idea how much power my family holds in this city? My mother wired that bail money before I even had to ask. The federal agents are a joke. My lawyers are already drafting a motion to dismiss this entire ridiculous spectacle. They are going to prove that you are a jealous, unhinged woman who orchestrated this entire setup to ruin my pristine reputation. I did not respond. I simply watched him perform his desperate monologue. My silence only seemed to fuel his rage. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, holding it up like a weapon. You played your hand, and now it is my turn, he said, his thumb aggressively tapping the screen. I am the primary account holder on every piece of plastic in your wallet. I am the vice president who brought the real money into this house while you played with your boring little spreadsheets. I just froze the checking account. I just froze the savings account. I just canceled the platinum card, the gold card, and the emergency credit line. You have absolutely zero access to my money. He marched into the kitchen, opened the utility drawer, and pulled out a heavy-duty black garbage bag. He balled it up in his fist and threw it forcefully at my chest. It hit me and dropped to the hardwood floor. Pack your cheap clothes and get out of my house, he ordered, his voice dripping with venom. You are going to leave everything I bought you right here. You can take whatever you brought with you from that pathetic working-class neighborhood you grew up in. I want you out on the street by nightfall. Let us see how far your boring numbers girl attitude gets you when you do not have a single dollar to your name. I looked down at the plastic bag on the floor, then back up to his flushed, angry face. Without a word, I bent down, picked up the garbage bag, and calmly walked toward the hallway closet. Trent followed me, his footsteps heavy and aggressive. He was laughing now, a harsh grating sound that bounced off the high ceilings. He thought he had completely checkmated me. He thought he had severed my lifeline. You cannot even afford a consultation with a decent divorce lawyer now, he taunted, leaning against the hallway wall as I opened the closet door. How are you going to fight me in court? You have nothing. I am going to drag this divorce out for years. I will drown you in legal paperwork until you are forced to move back into a cramped rental apartment just to survive. You are going to be begging me for a settlement when you realize you cannot afford to eat. I am going to break you, Kendra. I am going to make sure you never work in this city again. I ignored his threats. I reached into the closet and tossed a pair of running shoes and a gym jacket into the plastic bag. I did not need to pack my entire life. I just needed to pack enough to make him believe his pathetic intimidation tactic was working. I tied a loose knot at the top of the garbage bag, turned around, and walked past him back into the kitchen. Trent practically danced behind me, vibrating with victory. You better call an Uber quickly. I am giving you 10 minutes before I call the police and have you physically removed for trespassing on my property. I dropped the garbage bag on the floor next to the island. I reached out and pulled my structured leather briefcase toward me. The satisfying metallic click of the brass clasps opening made Trent pause his gloating for a fraction of a second. I reached inside, pulled out a thick, heavy legal envelope, and tossed it onto the marble countertop right in front of him. You froze the joint accounts containing exactly $3,000, I said, allowing a slow, deadly smirk to finally spread across my face. I transferred the rest of my personal earnings out of those accounts months ago. But more importantly, Trent, you really should have hired a better lawyer before you decided to play real estate mogul. Trent stared at the thick envelope, his arrogant smile faltering slightly. What is that? 2 years ago, you wanted to fund Sienna's luxury downtown apartment, I explained, my voice sharp and precise. But you did not want to use traceable funds from your own accounts. So you forged my signature to take out a massive second mortgage on this house. You thought I would never notice the paperwork because I was just your boring, oblivious wife. But when you forged my name to borrow against our primary residence, you triggered a highly specific penalty clause hidden deep within our prenuptial agreement. Trent reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the documents from the envelope. His eyes frantically scanned the dense legal jargon, searching for a loophole that did not exist. By committing financial fraud against your spouse, you legally forfeited your equity in this estate. I continued, stepping closer to the island to ensure he heard every single word. I executed the transfer clause last week. I legally assumed sole unencumbered ownership of this entire property through my private LLC. This house does not belong to you anymore, Trent. It belongs entirely to me. He dropped the papers onto the marble, his breathing turning shallow and rapid. You cannot do that. My mother paid the initial down payment on this house. This is my property. Your mother gifted that down payment to both of us, and you legally signed away your rights the moment you committed mortgage fraud to finance your mistress, I replied, picking up the garbage bag I had packed and shoving it firmly into his chest. You froze a useless bank account. I took the house. You have exactly 10 minutes to leave my property before I call the police and have you dragged out of here for trespassing. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my kitchen, casting a warm, golden glow across the flawless marble island. The house was entirely quiet. There was no sound of Trent complaining about his dry cleaning, no arrogant pacing, no condescending remarks about my choice of practical footwear. It was just me, a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, and the absolute certainty that I had thoroughly dismantled a monster. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the silence. Then my phone vibrated across the countertop, shattering the peace. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. I set my mug down and swiped to answer, placing the call on speakerphone. I did not say a word, preferring to let the caller reveal themselves first. I know you are listening, Kendra. A voice hissed through the speaker. It was Sienna, Trent's beloved executive assistant. The same woman who just yesterday had been sobbing hysterically in a federal interrogation room while Border Patrol agents cataloged her luggage full of cartel diamonds. Today, however, the panic in her voice had been replaced by a thin, brittle layer of manufactured bravado. Good morning, Sienna, I replied smoothly, leaning back against the counter. I am surprised they let you keep your phone. Did Trent's mother manage to bail you out too, or did you find another arrogant executive to fund your release? Do not play games with me, Sienna snapped, her voice rising in pitch. Trent kicked me out of his hotel room last night. He completely cut me off and blamed me for the entire disaster at the airport. He threw me to the wolves, Kendra. But I am not going down for this alone. I spent the entire night working on my laptop, and I have put together an insurance policy. I took another calm sip of my coffee. I am a forensic accountant, Sienna. I deal with corporate extortionists on a weekly basis. If you have a threat to make, I suggest you articulate it clearly and quickly. I have a very busy day ahead of me. Sienna let out a sharp, breathless laugh. Oh, you are going to want to hear this. I spent the last 12 hours fabricating a beautiful paper trail. I doctored a dozen corporate emails between Trent's secure server and your personal accounts. They look completely authentic. They show you giving Trent explicit step-by-step instructions on how to route cartel money through offshore shell companies. The emails make it look like you masterminded the entire diamond smuggling operation using your brilliant forensic accounting skills, and Trent was just your innocent, manipulated puppet. I remained completely silent, letting her delusion hang in the air. I want $100,000 wired into my personal checking account by noon today. Sienna demanded, her tone dripping with newfound confidence. If I do not see that money clear, I am forwarding this entire fabricated email chain directly to the lead FBI investigator handling Trent's case. You will be arrested before dinner. You can sit in a federal cell right next to your husband. Sienna clearly expected me to panic. She expected me to beg, to negotiate, or to break down in tears. When I said nothing, she took my silence as a sign of weakness and decided to twist the knife, leaning into the cruel, petty arrogance Trent had undoubtedly taught her. Trent always told me you were too incredibly stupid to see what was happening right in front of your face. Sienna taunted, her voice oozing with malicious satisfaction. We used to lie in bed and laugh at how easily you believed his lies. Do you have any idea how much the crocodile Birkin bag I brought to the airport cost? It was a $12,000 bag, Kendra. Trent bought it for me the exact same week he told you that repairing the transmission on your sensible little Honda was simply too expensive. You drove a rattling, broken-down piece of junk to work every single day trying to be financially responsible, while I was sipping crystal champagne and wearing designer jewelry entirely on his dime. You are pathetic. I let her finish. I let her breathe in the toxic fumes of her own perceived victory. Then I let out a genuine, unapologetic laugh. It was a cold, sharp sound that immediately silenced her on the other end of the line. You really should have hired a financial advisor, Sienna, I said, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative register. Or perhaps a decent defense attorney. Or maybe you should have just possessed basic, fundamental common sense before you decided to extort a woman who audits federal crimes for a living. What are you talking about? She stammered, the manufactured bravado instantly cracking. Did you honestly believe I only audited Trent's accounts? I asked, tracing the rim of my coffee mug. The moment I suspected Trent was hiding assets, I mapped out his entire financial ecosystem. That included you, Sienna. I pulled the routing numbers on every single luxury gift he bought you. I pulled the transaction data on every extravagant weekend getaway. And more importantly, I audited the generous monthly bonus checks Trent deposited directly into your personal bank account. Sienna was breathing heavily now, the phone rustling against her ear. Those were corporate bonuses for my work as his assistant. They were wire transfers from the retirement accounts of Trent's elderly clients. I corrected my tone, absolutely merciless. Trent was skimming offshore investments and funneling the stolen capital directly through your personal checking account to wash the money. You did not just read the fine print on those checks, Sienna. You actively signed the deposit slips. A choked gasp escaped her throat. You are not just a mistress who got caught holding a bag of dirty diamonds. I continued hammering the final nail into her coffin. Legally, the federal government categorizes you as his primary money mule. You facilitated the laundering of stolen civilian retirement funds. Extorting me for $100,000 is the absolute least of your problems right now. You are lying! Sienna screamed, her voice cracking with sheer terror. You are trying to scare me. I am going to send these emails to the FBI right now. You do not need to send them an email, Sienna, I said, walking out of my kitchen and staring out the large bay window toward the street. I sent the SEC and the FBI my fully completed forensic audit of your personal bank accounts at 4 o'clock this morning. I highlighted every single stolen deposit you ever signed for. Sienna began to hyperventilate. Walk over to the window of that luxury apartment Trent rented for you, I commanded. Look down at the street. The line was dead silent, except for the frantic sound of her footsteps rushing across hardwood floors. Then a loud, ragged scream echoed through the phone speaker, followed by the distinct sound of a heavy door being battered open. The call abruptly disconnected. The heavy mahogany doors of the Oakmont Country Club private dining room swung shut behind me with a solid, muffled thud. The air inside smelled of expensive gin-aged leather and pure desperation. I had received Beatrice's urgent summons for a so-called family intervention an hour ago. Under normal circumstances, I would have ignored it entirely. However, as a forensic accountant currently assisting a federal investigation, I knew that arrogant, desperate people made mistakes. I attended simply to gather more intel, and they were about to hand me a goldmine. Trent sat at the head of the long oak table. He looked remarkably worse than he had yesterday. His eyes were bloodshot and he was sweating through his designer polo shirt, but he still tried to project that familiar, untouchable arrogance. Beatrice sat to his right, her posture rigid, her signature pearls resting against her collarbone. Paige lounged on his left, swirling a mimosa in a crystal flute as if we were gathering for a Sunday brunch instead of dealing with multiple federal felonies. "Sit down," Kendra Beatrice ordered, gesturing to the single wooden chair positioned directly across from them at the far end of the table. I remained standing. "I prefer to keep this brief, Beatrice. What exactly is this intervention about?" Trent scoffed, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the polished wood. "We are offering you a lifeline, Kendra. An opportunity to walk away from this mess with something to show for it before you completely destroy your own life." He slid a thick ivory envelope across the length of the table. It came to a stop just inches from my hands. Paige smirked, taking a slow sip of her drink. "Open it," Paige commanded. "It is more money than you have ever seen at one time." I calmly reached out, opened the unsealed flap, and extracted the contents. There were two items. The first was a cashier's check made out to me in the amount of $50,000. The second was a densely typed non-disclosure agreement, complete with a secondary clause demanding a quiet, uncontested divorce, and a full signed confession stating that I alone had masterminded the diamond smuggling operation. I stared at the paperwork, genuinely amazed by their profound stupidity. "You brought me to a country club to bribe a federal witness with a $50,000 check." "It is not a bribe, it is a severance package," Beatrice stated coldly, adjusting her posture. "Let us be entirely realistic, Kendra. You were wearing off-the-rack polyester suits when my son found you. You were a nobody from a working-class neighborhood who did not even know which fork to use at a formal dinner. We tolerated your absolute lack of pedigree because Trent felt sorry for you. $50,000 is more than your parents managed to save in a decade. Take the money, sign the confession, and do the one thing you are actually good for. Protect this family." Trent nodded in agreement, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "I am a Vice President, Kendra. My career is the only thing that matters here. You are just a number cruncher. You can go to a minimum security facility for a few years, quietly serve your time, and when you get out, you will have this seed money to start over in some cheap Midwestern town where you belong. If you fight me, I will make sure the prosecutors tear you apart." Paige set her glass down with a sharp clink. "Trent is right. You have absolutely nothing to lose. You are completely expendable. Trent is the golden goose. You are just a glorified calculator. Sign the paper and take the fall, or my mother will make a few phone calls." Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Paige is not exaggerating, Kendra. I sit on the charity boards with the managing partners of every major accounting firm on the East Coast. If you refuse to sign that document right now, I will personally call every single one of them. I will have you blackballed from the financial sector. I will ruin your reputation so thoroughly that you will not even be able to get a job managing a cash register at a fast food restaurant. You will be entirely destitute." I stood perfectly still, letting their threats hang in the quiet dining room. They truly believed they held all the power. They were so accustomed to buying their way out of trouble that they could not comprehend the reality of their situation. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. Instead, I let out a low, genuine laugh. I reached into my tailored blazer, pulled out my favorite red grading pen, and clicked the top. I leaned over the table, uncapped the pen, and circled a massive paragraph on the second page of their legal document. "What are you doing?" Trent demanded, his voice rising in panic. "I am correcting a fatal typo in your jurisdiction clause," I replied smoothly, dragging the red ink across the page. "This non-disclosure agreement cites state law, but you are asking me to confess to federal smuggling charges. State courts have absolutely no jurisdiction over international cartel laundering. If you are going to actively extort a federal witness, Beatrice Wise strongly suggests you use a competent lawyer instead of downloading a generic template from the internet." Beatrice slammed her hand onto the table. "How dare you speak to me with that tone?" I clicked the pen shut and dropped it onto the table. I picked up my smartphone, which had been resting face up on the oak surface the entire time. The screen was illuminated, displaying an active, ongoing phone call. The call duration read 14 minutes and 30 seconds. "By the way," I said, flashing a bright, razor-sharp smile at the three of them. "DeAndre is reading this right now." Trent froze. "Who is DeAndre?" "DeAndre is the lead federal prosecutor for the SEC. I answered, tapping the speakerphone button so his deep, commanding voice filled the room. "Thank you for the live audio feed." Kendra DeAndre's voice echoed through the country club dining room. "I have recorded every word. Mr. Trent, Mrs. Beatrice, and Miss Page. I will be dispatching federal agents to your location immediately. You are all officially being charged with witness tampering, extortion, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Do not attempt to leave the premises." Beatrice let out a horrified, strangled gasp, clutching her pearls as the color drained from her face. Paige knocked over her mimosa, the orange liquid spilling across the table and ruining the forged documents. Trent staggered backward, his chair scraping violently against the floor as he clutched his chest. I picked up my briefcase, turned my back on their absolute devastation, and walked out the mahogany doors, leaving them to wait for the sirens. She was no longer yelling at me. She had spun around, directing her hysterical panic toward the far end of the private dining table. DeAndre had been sitting there the entire time, shrouded in the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains, nursing a cup of black coffee. He had watched his wife and her family attempt to bribe and extort me with the detached, analytical silence of a man evaluating an active crime scene. "Do something!" Paige shrieked, her hands gripping the edges of the oak table so hard her knuckles turned white. "You are a federal prosecutor, DeAndre. Stop her. Use your authority and shut this down right now. You fix this." DeAndre did not flinch. He did not reach for his phone or offer a word of comfort. He slowly lifted his porcelain cup, took a measured sip of his coffee, and set it back down on the saucer with a sharp, definitive click that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. He refused to even look in my direction, completely unwilling to participate in their desperate attempt to intimidate me. Trent slammed his fist into the ruined, juice-soaked non-disclosure agreement. "Did you hear your wife, DeAndre? Shut this down. I am your brother-in-law. You work for the government. You pull the strings and you make this ridiculous investigation go away. Do your job and protect this family." "My job," DeAndre said, his voice a deep, resonant calm that perfectly countered Trent's hysteria, "is to prosecute federal financial crimes, not to act as a personal cleanup crew for an arrogant amateur who got caught laundering cartel money." Trent's face shifted from pale panic to a mottled, furious red. The cornered animal was lashing out, resorting to the toxic superiority that defined their entire bloodline. "You listen to me," Trent snarled, pointing a trembling finger across the table. "You owe this family your entire career. You think you got that position at the U.S. Attorney Office on your own merit. You are nothing but a diversity hire, DeAndre. Beatrice made the calls. We gave you the connections. We let you into this country club. We gave you a seat at the table. You are going to use that badge to save my life, or I will make sure you are ruined right alongside her." DeAndre's face remained an impenetrable mask of stoicism, but I saw the subtle tightening of his jaw. It was the micro-reaction of a man who had endured a decade of Trent's thinly veiled racism. The country club whispers, the condescending remarks at holiday dinners. His silence in this moment highlighted years of Beatrice treating him like a high-profile charity project, and Paige wearing him on her arm like a progressive accessory, fully expecting him to be a compliant, grateful servant. They truly believed they owned him, just like they thought they owned me. I leaned against the heavy wooden door, crossing my arms. I was not leaving now. I would not miss this for the world. Paige rounded on her husband, her voice dropping into a vicious, demanding hiss. If you do not fix this right now, I will divorce you, DeAndre. I will take the house, the cars, and I will leave you with absolutely nothing. Stand up, intimidate that little spreadsheet pusher, and get me out of this. DeAndre looked at his wife. There was a profound emptiness in his eyes, as if he was finally looking at a stranger he had no interest in knowing. He calmly reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a crisp linen handkerchief, and dabbed the corner of his mouth. He stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket with meticulous precision. He was a foot taller than Trent, and the physical dominance he commanded in the room was absolute. He turned his gaze down the length of the table toward me. For a fraction of a second, he offered a single respectful nod. We were the only two outsiders who had ever married into this toxic family, and we were both walking out today. DeAndre looked back down at Trent with utter, unfiltered disgust. I do not owe you anything, Trent DeAndre said, his voice echoing with absolute finality. But you owe the IRS about $4 million. Good luck with that. DeAndre turned on his heel and walked straight toward me. I stepped aside, pulling the mahogany door wide open for him. He walked out into the corridor without a single backward glance, leaving his wife, his mother-in-law, and his brother-in-law drowning in the silence of their own destruction. I looked back at Trent one last time. He was staring at the empty doorway, his chest heaving, completely paralyzed by the realization that his money, his name, and his mother could no longer save him. I gave him a slow, deadly smirk, pulled the door shut, and walked out into the sunlight. The crisp afternoon sunlight felt entirely different as I walked across the manicured parking lot of the Oakmont Country Club. For the first time in years, the air tasted like absolute vindication. I slipped into the driver's seat of my practical, reliable car, closed the heavy door, and opened the secure laptop resting on the passenger seat. My screen was already alive with scrolling data. I did not need to be in the room to watch the empire fall. I had digital front row seats. DeAndre had not been making an idle threat. As a federal prosecutor, he wielded the power of the United States government, and within exactly 40 minutes of our departure, the federal machine moved with terrifying, beautiful efficiency. I sat in my car sipping a bottle of sparkling water, watching the secure financial feeds I had monitored for months. The first domino fell at precisely 2 in the afternoon. A massive red alert flashed across my screen. The Department of Justice had officially frozen Trent's primary checking and savings accounts. 2 minutes later, the freeze extended to his investment portfolios, then his domestic shell companies, then the joint accounts he shared with his mother Beatrice. I watched Beatrice's pristine, carefully guarded wealth evaporate into a legally inaccessible void. Her trust funds, her liquid assets, the country club escrow accounts she used to maintain her flawless high society image, all locked down by federal mandate. The millions they used to wield as a weapon against anyone they considered beneath them were suddenly untouchable. Trent was officially a millionaire, without a single cent to his name, marooned in the middle of an extortion plot gone completely wrong. But a narcissist cornered is a highly predictable creature. Trent had spent his entire life believing rules applied to everyone else, operating under the delusion that his pedigree made him invincible. If he could not use his own money, he would simply take mine. He needed a high-profile defense attorney immediately. He needed a fixer capable of navigating federal racketeering charges, diamond smuggling, and wire fraud. Those men required massive cash retainers up front, often in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. My phone chimed with a high-priority security alert. I smiled, resting my hands on the steering wheel. I had set up a specialized tracking protocol on my personal financial network weeks ago, anticipating this exact moment of desperation. A login attempt was pinging from a recognizable IP address. It was Trent's smartphone. He was trying to bypass the two-factor authentication on my private 401k and primary retirement accounts. I watched the screen as he guessed my first password. Incorrect. He tried a second time using my mother's maiden name. Incorrect. He tried a third time using our wedding anniversary. The arrogance of the man believing he could raid my future using the date he vowed to protect me was almost poetic. He thought I was just a naive number cruncher too stupid to update my security credentials. I decided to be generous. I reached over to my keyboard and manually disabled the security block, allowing his device to bypass the firewall. I granted him full, unhindered access to view the dashboard of my retirement portfolio. I counted the seconds out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the fifth second, my mobile phone began to ring. The caller ID flashed Trent's name in bright red letters. He had seen the balance. I answered the call, bringing the phone to my ear, completely silent. "Where is it?" Trent screamed, his voice tearing through the speaker with unhinged feral panic. "Where is the money, Kendra? I am looking at your retirement dashboard right now. It says 0. Every single account is empty. Where did you put my money?" I listened to his heavy, frantic breathing. He sounded like a man drowning, clawing at the surface for a lifeline that did not exist. "Your money," I echoed, keeping my tone unnervingly calm and quiet. "That is a fascinating choice of words for an account registered solely under my social security number, Trent. It is marital property," he roared, his voice echoing off what sounded like the tiled walls of the country club restroom. "You have been hiding assets from me. You drained the 401k. You drained your stock portfolios. That is a federal offense, Kendra. You are concealing marital assets during an active legal separation. I need a retainer from my defense lawyer right now, and you are going to transfer those funds back into a joint account before I report you for financial fraud. I will ruin you." He was so blinded by panic that he actually believed he still possessed leverage. He was clinging to the illusion of authority, desperately trying to command a woman who had already dismantled his entire life. "I didn't hide them," I replied, my voice slicing through his hysteria with absolute precision. "I transferred them to an impenetrable offshore trust months ago when I found out you were defrauding elderly clients." He went completely silent. "You see, I knew the moment the federal government caught wind of your little laundering operation, they would freeze every single asset tied to your name," I explained, laying out the facts with clinical detachment. "If I had left my retirement funds in a domestic account connected to our marriage, they would have been seized in the crossfire. I legally protected my hard-earned money from your criminal fallout. You have absolutely zero legal claim to that offshore trust, and the feds cannot touch it either. You cannot do that." He gasped, his voice cracking. "I need that money, Kendra. My mother's accounts are locked. Paige's accounts are locked. I cannot even buy a cup of coffee right now. You have to give me that money. I am going to federal prison." "Oh, and Trent?" I interrupted, ignoring his pathetic begging. I leaned forward, staring at the exact IP address logging data displayed on my laptop screen. "I also forwarded your IP address login attempt to the federal judge. You just committed wire fraud while out on bail." The line went dead. The metallic click of my secure keycard echoing through the pristine glass lobby of my firm was the perfect palate cleanser. Leaving Trent to hyperventilate over his frozen assets and impending wire fraud charges had been exhilarating, but walking into my actual domain was where I held true power. The air in the building was cool and filtered, smelling faintly of expensive espresso and polished steel. It was a monument to order, logic, and consequence. Everything my husband and his mother fundamentally lacked. I bypassed my private office and headed straight down the executive corridor. Sylvia's assistant, a sharp young man named David, caught my eye the moment I stepped off the private elevator. He did not say a word, simply pointing silently toward Sylvia's corner office. Through the soundproof glass, I could see her. Sylvia was the managing director of the firm, a woman who had built her career by tearing apart the financial ledgers of corrupt executives. She was sitting rigidly behind her massive desk, her hand hovering over the speakerphone button on her multi-line console. She looked up, caught my eye, and gestured for me to enter. "We have a highly agitated situation," Sylvia said quietly as I closed the heavy mahogany door behind me, sealing us in complete silence. "A woman identifying herself as Beatrice, along with your husband, bypassed reception by claiming they had urgent classified information regarding an active corporate embezzlement ring operating from within this exact office. They demanded the managing director. I decided to take the call myself. I took a seat in the leather chair opposite her desk, a slow, knowing smile spreading across my face. I nodded, settling into the plush cushions. Sylvia pressed the illuminated speaker button, and the sound of Beatrice's shrill, aristocratic voice immediately flooded the quiet office. I am only bringing this to your attention out of a profound sense of civic and ethical duty. Sylvia Beatrice was saying, her tone dripping with manufactured concern and weaponized privilege. I know how highly your firm values integrity and discretion. It is simply tragic that you have been harboring a viper in your ranks. Kendra is entirely unstable. She has suffered a complete psychological break and she is actively stealing from her own family to fund her delusions. Those are incredibly severe allegations, ma'am, Sylvia replied, her voice maintaining the cool, measured detachment of a seasoned executive. Are you stating that Kendra is a thief? She is a pathological liar, Sylvia Beatrice spat, dropping the faux polite facade. I warned my son about this years ago. You can dress a girl in designer suits and teach her how to hold a crystal wine glass, but you cannot wash off trailer park trash. She comes from a pathetic working-class neighborhood filled with nothing but resentment and greed. She has spent her entire life trying to scheme her way into our social strata. The moment my son faced a minor legal misunderstanding, she showed her true grimy colors. She is an absolute fraud, and she is actively embezzling funds as we speak. I casually crossed my legs and picked up a silver pen from Sylvia's desk, twirling it between my fingers. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I only felt an overwhelming sense of pity for two people so blinded by their own arrogance that they could not see the massive trap closing around them. They truly believed the world operated solely on their demands. They thought they could snap their fingers, make a few phone calls, and erase my entire existence. She drained our entire life savings, Trent yelled, his voice suddenly cutting through the background, sounding frantic and unhinged. She stole my money, Sylvia. She emptied our joint accounts, and I know for a fact she is using your corporate network to hide it. I need to hire a defense attorney today, and she is holding my funds hostage. If she is stealing from me, she is stealing from your clients right now. You need to terminate her employment immediately. You need to have security march her out of that building, and you need to call the police. If you do not fire her today, my mother and I will personally hold your firm liable for harboring a criminal. Sylvia met my gaze across the desk, her expression perfectly flat. She picked up a notepad and jotted down a few notes, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the other end of the line uncomfortable. I sit on the charity boards with half of your firm's elite clientele. Sylvia Beatrice added, the implicit threat hanging heavy in the air. I will make sure everyone in this city knows that your company protects unstable, thieving women from the slums. You will fire her, you will seize her computer, and you will freeze her corporate assets until the authorities arrive. Do I make myself absolutely clear? Sylvia calmly leaned forward, resting her elbows on the cool steel of her desk. She did not raise her voice. She did not sound intimidated. She sounded like a predator finally snapping its jaws shut. Ma'am, Sylvia replied, her tone perfectly steady and completely lethal. Kendra isn't just an employee. She is the lead forensic auditor for the FBI's Joint Task Force on Corporate Corruption. Everything you just said was recorded as attempted witness intimidation. The silence on the conference call was absolute. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound in Sylvia's office was the faint, static hum of the speakerphone. Then came the frantic, clumsy clatter of a receiver being slammed down on the other end. Trent had hung up. He did not yell. He did not issue another hollow threat. He simply severed the connection and ran. Miles away inside the opulent oak-paneled lobby of the Oakmont Country Club, Trent practically threw his phone across the room. He stumbled backward, knocking over a heavy brass standing ashtray. The sharp crash echoed through the empty corridor, but Trent did not register the noise. His vision tunneled, his lungs seized. Beatrice stood frozen near the coat check, her manicured hands trembling against her pearl necklace. She demanded to know what Sylvia meant, her voice pitching into a hysterical shriek, but Trent completely ignored her. He shoved past his own mother, his shoulder clipping the mahogany doorframe as he sprinted out into the humid afternoon air. He needed to leave the country. The federal government had frozen his checking accounts, his investment portfolios, and his domestic shell companies. He was facing active wire fraud charges, witness intimidation, and corporate racketeering. His passport was likely flagged, but with enough untraceable cash, a man with his connections could buy a new identity, a private chartered flight, and a quiet life in a non-extradition territory. He just needed to get to his contingency plan. For 3 years, Trent had carefully siphoned a percentage of his laundered funds away from the cartel ledgers and away from his family's shared accounts. He was a deeply arrogant man, but he was not entirely without a survival instinct. He had amassed exactly $2 million in crisp, unmarked $100 bills and highly liquid bearer bonds. It was his golden parachute, and it was waiting for him in the dead center of the city. Midnight arrived with a heavy, oppressive fog settling over the industrial district. Trent drove a battered 10-year-old sedan. He had paid a valet at the country club $1,000 in cash to borrow. He kept his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, terrified that every pair of headlights belonged to a federal tail. He finally pulled up to the heavy iron gates of Apex Secure Storage. This was not a run-of-the-mill storage facility. It was an elite climate-controlled fortress designed for wealthy clients to store vintage automobiles, private art collections, and highly sensitive assets. It featured 24-hour armed security biometric scanners and total anonymity. Trent parked in the shadows and walked briskly toward the side entrance, pulling his baseball cap low over his eyes. He approached the reinforced steel door and pressed his thumb against the glowing green biometric pad. A mechanized voice chimed a soft greeting, and the heavy door clicked open. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing loudly against the polished concrete floors. The facility was deathly quiet, bathed in harsh white fluorescent light. Rows of pristine orange rolling doors stretched down the seemingly endless corridor. Trent felt a surge of manic relief wash over him. He was going to make it. He was going to walk out of this building with $2 million in a duffel bag, and Kendra could spend the rest of her miserable life auditing empty bank accounts. He reached Unit 402. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely punch the 6-digit code into the keypad mounted on the cinderblock wall. The light on the pad flashed green. With a loud metallic grind, the heavy rolling door began to ascend, coiling into the ceiling. Trent stepped forward, his eyes wide, anticipating the familiar sight of the 3 heavy-duty steel safes he had bolted to the floor. He anticipated the smell of the canvas bags. He anticipated salvation. Trent hit the interior light switch. He stopped breathing. He simply stood perfectly still, his eyes darting frantically across the space, unable to process the visual information his brain was receiving. The climate-controlled unit was massive, pristine, and completely, utterly empty. There were no steel safes. There were no canvas bags. There was not a single scrap of paper, a stray rubber band, or a trace of dust on the polished concrete floor. The $2 million he had meticulously hidden from the world, from the federal government, and from his wife, had vanished into thin air. Trent dropped to his knees. The harsh reality of his situation crushed him with the weight of a collapsing building. He let out a strangled, breathless sob, pressing his forehead against the cold floor. He had nothing. He was a fugitive with a borrowed sedan and a pocket full of valet tips. Then he noticed it. Positioned in the exact mathematical center of the barren room was a single cheap metal folding chair. It was positioned to face the open doorway. Resting on the seat of the chair was a crisp white envelope secured with a single piece of clear tape. Trent crawled forward on his hands and knees, his breath hitching in his throat. He reached up, his fingers trembling violently, and ripped the envelope from the metal seat. He tore the paper open and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cardstock. The handwriting was neat, precise, and instantly recognizable. It was Kendra's handwriting. He held the note up to the fluorescent light, his eyes scanning the incredibly brief message. "Did you really think I didn't notice the $400 monthly charge on the corporate card you claimed was for golf club storage? The FBI thanks you for your profound generosity and your massive donation to the Federal Seizure Fund. Turn around." Trent froze. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He did not want to turn around. He wanted the concrete floor to open up and swallow him whole. Slowly, agonizingly, he turned his head toward the open doorway of Unit 402. The pristine white walls of the storage corridor were no longer white. They were pulsing with a harsh, rhythmic strobe. Brilliant flashes of red and blue light bounced off the polished concrete, casting long, jagged shadows into the room. The deafening chirp of a police siren chirped twice in the enclosed space, followed by the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots marching down the hallway. The profound, unbroken silence of my living room was a luxury I had not experienced in over a decade. The digital clock on my kitchen island glowed a steady red, displaying 2:14 in the morning. Somewhere downtown, Trent was currently surrendering his belt and shoelaces to a federal booking officer stripped of his wealth, his mother's influence, and his unearned pride. I stood by the granite counter, the warm ceramic of my teacup grounding me in the present reality. I had won. I had dismantled the architecture of their deceit brick by brick. That pristine, hard-earned peace shattered with the deafening explosion of breaking glass. The heavy reinforced French doors leading to my backyard patio splintered violently inward. Shards of thick glass rained across the polished hardwood floor like jagged diamonds. I did not scream. I did not run. I simply placed my teacup on the granite surface and watched as a figure stepped through the ruined doorframe into the shadows of my home. It was Sienna. She looked absolutely nothing like the immaculate, heavily curated woman who had spent the last 3 years clinging to my husband's arm at corporate galas. Her expensive silk dress was ripped at the hem, stained with mud, and snagged on the thorns from my rose bushes. She was barefoot, a thin line of blood trickling down her left calf from scaling the perimeter fence. Her hair was a tangled, chaotic mess around her face, and her eyes were wide with a manic, unhinged desperation. In her hands, she gripped a heavy titanium driver. It was one of Trent's custom golf clubs, the very same set he used to justify the storage unit where he had hidden his laundered millions. She did not say a word to me. She simply raised the titanium club and brought it down with terrifying force onto the glass coffee table in the center of the room. The surface exploded into 1,000 glittering pieces. She swung again blindly, viciously obliterating a towering porcelain vase that Beatrice had forced upon us as a wedding gift. She was a woman drowning in the consequences of her own actions, lashing out at the only person she could blame. I remained perfectly still behind the kitchen island. I evaluated her posture, her grip on the weapon, and the absolute lack of logic in her eyes. She was out on bail. I knew the federal prosecutors had swept her up in the initial cartel raids early yesterday morning, tying her name directly to the fraudulent shell companies Trent had used to move the diamond money. She was facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary, and the reality of that sentence had completely fractured her sanity. "You ruined my life!" Sienna screamed, pointing the head of the golf club directly at my chest. Her chest heaved with heavy, ragged breaths. "You ruined everything. We were supposed to be completely free. We had the money. We had the plan." She took a step closer, the glass crunching sickeningly beneath her bare feet. She did not even flinch at the pain. She was entirely consumed by her own toxic entitlement. "He promised me," she shrieked, swinging the club and shattering a framed photograph on the side table. "Trent promised me that we were leaving. He was going to file the divorce papers the second the offshore accounts cleared. We had a penthouse waiting for us in Dubai. We were going to walk away with millions, and you were just supposed to take the fall. You were the boring, pathetic little accountant. You were just a spreadsheet to him. He loved me. He promised me Dubai Kendra." I looked at her, truly looking at the pathetic broken shell of a woman who had willingly helped a man defraud the elderly and launder blood money just to fund a luxury lifestyle. "Trent lied to you, Sienna," I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria with a calm, surgical precision. "He never loved you. You were a convenient accessory and a disposable accomplice. If he actually intended to take you to Dubai, he would not have left your signature on all the fraudulent incorporation documents. He set you up to take the exact same fall he planned for me. You were just too blinded by the designer bags to read the paperwork." She let out a guttural scream of denial, raising the club high above her head. She charged forward, closing the distance until she was standing just on the other side of the granite island. The heavy titanium driver hovered in the air, trembling in her tight grip. She reached into the bodice of her torn silk dress and pulled out a crumpled, damp piece of paper. She slammed it onto the counter, smearing a drop of her own blood across the typed words. It was a hastily drafted legal affidavit. "Sign it!" Sienna demanded, her voice dropping into a ragged, venomous hiss. "Sign this paper right now. It is a sworn statement saying that I had absolutely no knowledge of the smuggling operation. It says you and Trent acted alone and that I was an unwitting victim. Sign it, clear my name, and tell the prosecutors to drop my charges. I stared at the crumpled paper, genuinely fascinated by the profound depths of her stupidity. You broke into the home of a federal witness in the middle of the night to extort a confession. If you do not sign that paper right now, I will beat you to death in your own kitchen. Sienna threatened, her knuckles turning white around the grip of the golf club. I am not spending 20 years in a federal cage because Trent was a careless idiot and you were too jealous to let us go. Sign the paper, Kendra. I have absolutely nothing left to lose. I looked at the heavy titanium club poised above my head. I looked at the blood on her feet and the absolute madness in her eyes. I did not reach for a pen. I did not back away. I did not show her a single ounce of the fear she so desperately craved. Instead, I casually raised my right hand and pointed a single finger toward the upper corner of the kitchen ceiling. You really are stupid, Sienna, I said, my voice echoing in the sudden tense silence of the ruined room. This whole house is wired to a live-stream security feed connected directly to DeAndre's office at the Department of Justice. You just committed armed burglary. Sienna froze. The golf club wavered in the air. Slowly, her eyes tracked my pointing finger up to the ceiling corner, locking onto the small black dome of the security camera. The tiny red recording light blinked steadily, an unblinking mechanical eye that had just captured every single second of her violent, unhinged threat. The color vanished entirely from her face. The heavy titanium driver slipped from her numb fingers, clattering loudly against the granite counter before hitting the floor. She staggered backward, her hands flying to her mouth in absolute paralyzing horror, as the reality of her actions finally breached her delusion. She had not just violated her bail conditions, she had just handed the federal prosecutors a guaranteed, irrefutable conviction for armed home invasion, witness tampering, and attempted murder. In the distance, cutting through the quiet night air, the sharp, unmistakable wail of police sirens began to rise. The flashing red and blue lights reflecting off my shattered French doors faded into the distance as the police cruisers hauled Sienna away. I stood in the wreckage of my living room, sweeping a pile of broken glass into a dustpan with absolute mechanical precision. My physical space was a disaster, but my life had never been cleaner. I had excised the rot. However, a family accustomed to generational immunity does not surrender simply because they are beaten. They surrender when they are eradicated. Trent was currently confined to his mother's sprawling estate. The federal judge had granted him bail but slapped a heavy GPS-enabled ankle monitor on his leg and restricted his movement entirely. He was a prisoner in Beatrice's gilded cage, stripped of his offshore parachute, devoid of his corporate titles, and entirely out of options. But a narcissist locked in a corner will invariably drag others down with him. He could no longer fight me in a courtroom, so he decided to try me in the court of public opinion. The digital assault began on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a forensic ledger when my phone began vibrating continuously. It was not a steady stream of notifications, but an absolute avalanche. Within seconds, my inbox, my professional networking profiles, and my personal messaging apps were flooded with identical links. I clicked the top notification. It opened a social media platform directing me to a newly created anonymous account. The single post featured a stark black screen with an audio file attached. I pressed play. The voice that echoed from my phone speakers was mine. The cadence, the specific inflection I used when I was frustrated, the slight drop in pitch at the end of a sentence. It was perfectly, terrifyingly accurate. I knew about the cartel money from the start, the synthesized voice of me confessed. Trent was too stupid to hide it properly. All I had to do was slip the diamonds into his golf bag before the audit and tip off the feds. I get the offshore accounts, he takes the fall, and I walk away clean. He never suspected a thing. I listened to the clip twice. It was a masterpiece of artificial intelligence. A deepfake generated by feeding hours of my recorded corporate presentations into an audio synthesis program. It was designed to completely destroy my credibility as a federal witness. Before I could even close the application, the algorithm fed me the next piece of their orchestrated campaign. Paige had weaponized her country club tears. Her video was already sitting at 250,000 views. She sat in her pristine living room wearing an oversized, modest sweater devoid of her usual heavy makeup. She stared directly into the camera, her eyes red and swimming with perfectly timed tears. For years, my family welcomed Kendra with open arms. Paige sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. We loved her. We trusted her. We had absolutely no idea she was an abusive, manipulative predator. She systematically isolated my brother, gaslighted my mother, and orchestrated a massive criminal conspiracy just to steal our family's wealth. Please listen to her own confession. Share the audio. Help us get justice for my brother. I watched the view count tick upward in real time. Thousands of comments poured in attacking my character, demanding my arrest, and rallying behind Paige's flawless performance as the devastated victim. They thought they had won. They thought this viral smear campaign would force the Department of Justice to drop my testimony. They believed public outrage could override federal evidence. They forgot what I actually do for a living. I did not issue a press release. I did not post a tearful rebuttal video. I simply looked at the clock. I had a scheduled firm-wide webinar set to begin in exactly 2 hours. As the lead forensic auditor for the FBI Joint Task Force on Corporate Corruption, I regularly train junior analysts and visiting federal agents on identifying digital financial manipulation. Today, I decided to change the curriculum. At precisely noon, I logged into the broadcasting software. Over 3,000 professionals, including multiple agents from the Cybercrimes Division, logged in to watch. I activated my camera sitting perfectly upright in my tailored blazer, staring into the lens with absolute chilling calm. "Good afternoon," I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear. "Today we are going to pivot from standard ledger auditing to advanced digital forensics. Specifically, how amateur criminals attempt to fabricate evidence using artificial intelligence and the lethal mistakes they make in the process." I shared my screen with the entire audience. I pulled up the viral audio file of my supposed confession and dropped it directly into a high-level spectrographic analysis program used by the Bureau. The audio wave expanded across the screen in bright, jagged colors. When an artificial intelligence generates human speech, it fails to replicate the natural breathing patterns and microfrequency shifts of an actual human vocal cord. I explained, highlighting a specific section of the audio wave with my cursor. Notice the complete absence of inhalation between these two sentences. Furthermore, the background noise profile drops to absolute zero during the consonant sounds. This is a synthetic rendering. It is a deepfake. I clicked a new tab, opening a raw metadata extractor. But dismantling the audio is only the first step. I continued, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Every digital file leaves a fingerprint. When you download, alter, and upload a file, the code embeds the creator's digital signature. Lines of complex hexadecimal code cascaded down the shared screen. I ran a decryption script, stripping away the anonymous routing layers the creator had clumsily attempted to use. The screen blinked, finalizing the extraction. A single line of text remained highlighted in bright green. I leaned into the microphone. As you can see, the metadata points directly to the originating network where this synthetic file was rendered and originally uploaded. I highlighted the specific string of numbers on the screen. It was an IPv6 address. I cross-referenced it with a public ISP registry, bringing up the localized geographic coordinates. The map on the screen zoomed in, dropping a bright red pin directly onto an affluent gated neighborhood. "You really are stupid, Paige," I said, addressing the camera directly, knowing exactly who was watching this feed. "This IP address originates directly from your personal home Wi-Fi network. You did not just post a defamatory video, you fabricated digital evidence in an attempt to frame a federal witness." I stopped sharing the screen and looked dead into the camera lens. "You just committed federal cyber defamation and evidence tampering," I stated, my voice ringing with total unyielding authority. "The digital footprint has already been mirrored to the federal prosecutor's secure server." I ended the broadcast. I stood up, walked to my office window, and looked out over the sprawling city. I did not need to be in Paige's neighborhood to know what was happening. I could vividly imagine her sitting in her pristine living room, her phone dropping from her manicured hands as the reality of her profound arrogance finally caught up to her. In the distance, cutting through the ambient hum of the city traffic, the faint but unmistakable wail of police sirens began to rise. The fallout from the webinar was instantaneous. While federal agents were dispatching to Paige's suburban address to seize her electronics, I remained at my desk organizing the digital evidence files for the prosecution. The firm was buzzing with the adrenaline of the broadcast, but the quiet of my office was suddenly pierced by the urgent ring of my console phone. My firm's lobby was heavily secured, but the receptionist's voice trembled with sheer panic. Beatrice had breached the building. She had pushed past the security turnstiles directly behind a delivery courier and was currently screaming my name, demanding an immediate audience. I did not rush. I locked my workstation, smoothed the wrinkles from my blazer, and took the private elevator down to the atrium. The glass-walled lobby of my firm was usually a sanctuary of quiet professional efficiency. Today it resembled a chaotic theater stage. A large crowd of executives, clients, and security personnel had formed a wide circle near the reception desk. At the center of the ring stood Beatrice. She looked disheveled, her normally immaculate hair frizzy and wild, her designer coat buttoned unevenly. When the elevator doors chimed and I stepped onto the polished marble floor, her eyes locked onto me with the manic intensity of a cornered predator. She did not march toward me to deliver a threat. Instead, she executed a maneuver she had perfected over decades of social manipulation. Beatrice let out a sharp, ragged gasp. Her heavily ringed hands flew to her chest, clutching the expensive fabric of her coat. Her knees buckled in a synchronized, dramatic collapse, sending her tumbling onto the cold marble floor. Gasps echoed from the surrounding crowd. Several people lunged forward to help, but Beatrice weakly waved them away, keeping her eyes fixed entirely on me. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. She contorted her face into a mask of pure agony, thrashing slightly against the floor. "You are killing me!" she wailed, her voice projecting perfectly to ensure every single person in the lobby heard her. "You are murdering me, Kendra. My heart is failing. You took everything from my son. You destroyed my daughter. And now the stress is stopping my heart. I am dying on this floor because of your vindictive jealousy." It was a brilliant, terrifying performance. The crowd murmured in shock and discomfort, shooting me judgmental glares. A junior accountant frantically dialed emergency services. This was exactly how Beatrice operated. I vividly remembered her executing a similar, though less lethal performance at my wedding rehearsal dinner. She had faked a sudden severe vertigo spell just long enough to force the venue coordinator to change the seating arrangements, placing her elite friends at the head table and relegating my working-class family to the back corner near the kitchen doors. She used engineered vulnerability as a weapon to force compliance. I walked slowly toward her, stopping just outside her reach. I did not kneel. I did not offer comfort. Beatrice's hand trembled violently as she reached into her spilled designer handbag. She pulled out a thick, folded legal document and a gold pen. She thrust them weakly into the air toward me. "Please," she gasped, forcing a single tear to spill over her cheek. "Please, Kendra, I am begging you as a dying mother. Sign this release form. It authorizes the federal government to unfreeze Trent's emergency assets. Let me pay for my private medical care. Let me save my family before I take my last breath. Just sign the paper and let this nightmare end." She was attempting to leverage public shame and a fabricated medical emergency to secure my signature on a federal asset release. If I signed it under duress, the funds would immediately transfer, effectively making me an accomplice and nullifying my credibility as a witness against Trent. It was her final desperate play. The wail of an approaching ambulance cut through the tense silence of the lobby. The heavy revolving glass doors spun rapidly as two paramedics rushed inside, lugging heavy trauma bags and an automated external defibrillator. The security guards parted the crowd, allowing the medical team to drop to their knees beside Beatrice. "Ma'am, try to remain calm," the lead paramedic instructed, reaching for her wrist to check her pulse while his partner began tearing open a blood pressure cuff. "Are you experiencing pain radiating down your left arm?" Beatrice nodded frantically, squeezing her eyes shut and letting out a pathetic, high-pitched moan. I calmly reached into my leather portfolio. I pulled out a thick stapled dossier featuring the official seal of a premier private medical clinic. I took a step forward and tapped the lead paramedic on the shoulder. He looked up, annoyed by the interruption, until I handed him the file. Do not waste your epinephrine, I stated, my voice ringing clear and authoritative across the quiet lobby. That is a comprehensive copy of her latest medical report. I legally subpoenaed those records last month during the asset discovery phase of her son's racketeering investigation. The paramedic glanced at the file, then back at me, clearly confused. I looked down at the woman thrashing on the floor and laid out the facts for the entire room. Her resting blood pressure is flawless, I announced. Her cholesterol levels are perfect. In fact, she passed a grueling comprehensive cardiovascular stress test exactly 3 weeks ago in order to qualify for a highly exclusive offshore life insurance policy. She is in exceptional physical health. This is a theatrical performance, not a cardiac event. The paramedic paused, his fingers still resting on Beatrice's wrist. He looked down at her. Her pulse is strong and steady, he muttered to his partner, his professional urgency instantly evaporating into profound irritation. The murmur of the crowd shifted immediately. The sympathetic gasps turned into scoffs of disgust and angry whispers. The public pressure Beatrice had relied upon dissolved into cold, hard judgment. I knelt down on the marble floor, bringing my face level with hers. I smoothly pulled the folded legal document from her trembling fingers. She did not fight me for it. Her eyes were wide, darting nervously around the lobby as she realized her captive audience had turned entirely against her. I flattened the paper against my knee and scanned the dense legal text. It was not a standard asset release form. It was a labyrinth of corporate jargon designed to shift the ownership of 5 offshore shell companies directly into my name, retroactively making me the primary beneficiary of the laundered money. I looked back down at the woman who had spent years calling me trash, who had enabled a criminal empire, and who was now lying on a marble floor faking a heart attack to trap me. Her heart is perfectly fine, I said, raising my voice so the entire lobby, the paramedics, and the security team could hear me clearly. But her bank account isn't. I leaned in an inch closer, locking eyes with Beatrice, dropping my voice to a sharp, lethal register meant only for her. Beatrice. The document you just tried to force me to sign is a confession of tax evasion. It explicitly links you to the fraudulent accounts currently under federal investigation. If you don't get up right now, I'm handing it to the IRS. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The dying, fragile matriarch vanished. Beatrice's eyes snapped open with sharp, vivid clarity. She scrambled up from the floor with shocking agility, snatching her designer bag from the marble. She did not gasp for air. She did not clutch her chest. She simply glared at me with absolute undisguised venom. She smoothed the front of her coat, shoved violently past the bewildered paramedics, and stormed out through the glass doors, disappearing into the chaotic rush of the city. The silence of my suburban home later that evening offered a jarring contrast to the absolute spectacle Beatrice had orchestrated in my lobby. I sat at my kitchen island, nursing a cup of black tea, reviewing the final encrypted file transfers with cold mechanical precision. The entire fraudulent syndicate Trent had built was currently bleeding out on a federal prosecutor's desk. The bank accounts were frozen. The shell companies were dismantled. The accomplices were turning on each other. Trent was completely out of options. But a cornered narcissist who realizes he is inevitably going to prison does not simply surrender. He lashes out. He attacks the one thing standing between him and freedom. He could no longer fight my financial evidence, so he decided to destroy the credibility of the woman presenting it. The heavy rhythmic pounding on my front door rattled the glass panes in their frames. It was not a polite neighborly knock. It was a firm demand for entry. I walked to the foyer and checked the security monitor. 2 large men in sterile white uniforms stood on my porch, flanked by a local city police officer. An unmarked white transport van sat idling in my driveway. I opened the door, keeping the heavy brass chain engaged, and looked directly at the officer. "Good evening," I stated, my voice completely level. "How can I help you, officer?" "Ma'am," the officer said, his hand resting casually near his radio. His tone carried that specific practiced gentleness reserved for dealing with the unstable. "Are you Kendra?" "I am." "We received a highly concerning call from a family member," he continued, glancing at a clipboard in his hand. "Your ex-husband reported that you are experiencing a severe mental health crisis. He stated you are suffering from paranoid delusions involving cartels, corporate conspiracies, and federal investigations. He also indicated you have made threats to harm yourself and others in a manic state." I stared at him, the sheer audacity of Trent's strategy snapping into sharp focus. It was a classic brutal maneuver. He was trying to have me forcibly committed under an involuntary 72-hour psychiatric hold. If he succeeded, my testimony would be permanently tainted. A defense attorney would have a field day discrediting a star federal witness who had been institutionalized for paranoid delusions right in the middle of a high-stakes racketeering trial. "I am entirely fine, officer," I stated, my voice projecting absolute authority. "I am the lead forensic auditor on a joint task force investigation. My ex-husband is the primary target of that federal probe. This is a retaliatory swatting attempt designed to silence a witness." The officer exchanged a tired, knowing look with the taller of the two orderlies. "Ma'am, that is exactly what someone experiencing a psychotic break would say," the orderly murmured. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the door. "We just want to get you to a safe environment so a doctor can properly evaluate you. You need to undo that chain and come with us willingly, or we will have to use restraints for your own protection." I took a measured step back, creating distance. "I am not going anywhere. If you lay a hand on me, you will be interfering with an active federal informant. I highly suggest you run my name through your dispatch before you make a career-ending mistake." The officer shook his head, pulling a folded mental health warrant from his pocket. It possessed the signature of a local judge, undoubtedly pushed through by one of Trent's remaining highly paid legal contacts. "We have a signed order, Kendra. We are doing this the easy way or the hard way." The two orderlies stepped forward, unhooking soft nylon restraints from their belts. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my mind remained hyper-focused. I scanned the street through the narrow gap in the doorway. Parked half a block away, idling in the deep shadows of the neighborhood oak trees, was a sleek, black luxury sedan. The tinted windows obscured the driver, but I did not need to see his face. Trent was sitting there watching his masterpiece unfold. He wanted to witness the exact moment I was dragged out of my home in restraints. Before the orderlies could shove their weight against the door, the screech of heavy tires shattered the quiet suburban street. A massive black government-issued SUV violently hopped the curb, tearing across my front lawn and slamming on its brakes, completely blocking the transport van in my driveway. The driver's side door flew open before the vehicle had even fully stopped. DeAndre stepped out. He was an absolute force of nature. Dressed in a tactical windbreaker over a crisp suit, his presence commanded immediate, undeniable authority. He did not walk toward the porch. He stalked toward it. The local police officer turned his hand, dropping to his radio, but he froze when DeAndre raised his right hand, holding a leather credentials wallet open. The bright gold shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation caught the glow of the porch light. "Back away from that door right now!" DeAndre barked, his voice carrying the lethal weight of a federal mandate. The local officer held up his hands defensively. "Sir, we have a judge's order for a psychiatric hold on this individual." DeAndre did not even look at the paperwork the officer offered. He slapped it away with the back of his hand. "I do not care if you have a note from the mayor," DeAndre snapped, stepping directly between my front door and the orderlies. "You are standing on the property of a protected federal informant. You are actively attempting to detain the star witness in a massive multinational racketeering case." The color instantly drained from the local officer's face. He looked at me, then back at DeAndre, the terrifying reality of his situation sinking in. He had been played. "She is not delusional," DeAndre continued, his eyes locked onto the officer. "The cartel she warned you about is real. The corporate conspiracy is real. And if you or these orderlies attempt to place so much as a single nylon strap on her wrists, you will be spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Stand down. Stand." The orderlies instantly took 3 large steps backward, frantically hooking the restraints back onto their belts. The local officer grabbed his radio, his voice shaking as he canceled the transport order with dispatch. "Now," DeAndre said, pointing a rigid finger toward the street. "Get off this property." The 3 men scrambled away, practically running toward their vehicles. I let out a long, shaky breath, unlatching the chain and stepping out onto the porch. DeAndre turned to me, his expression softening for just a fraction of a second to ensure I was unharmed before his gaze snapped toward the street. He walked out to the edge of the lawn, standing tall and imposing under the streetlights. He looked directly down the block, locking eyes with the tinted windshield of the black luxury sedan, idling in the shadows. DeAndre raised his hand and pointed directly at the car. His voice boomed across the quiet neighborhood, carrying absolute chilling certainty. "Run, Trent. Run as fast as you can, it won't help." The taillights of Trent's black sedan faded into the suburban gloom, leaving the quiet street bathed in the flashing amber lights of DeAndre's federal vehicle. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the war was shifting from my front lawn to the absolute unyielding arena of the federal judiciary. Trent had played his final desperate card outside the bounds of the law, and he had failed spectacularly. 3 days later, the endgame officially began. DeAndre walked into my secured office suite and placed a thick cream-colored envelope directly onto the center of my desk. It was heavy embossed with the seal of the Department of Justice. The federal grand jury had been convened. Inside was my official subpoena to testify. It was not merely a request for my presence. It was a mandate to strike the killing blow against Trent's entire syndicate. The morning of my testimony dawned gray and biting cold. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, my posture rigidly straight, as I pulled my car into the subterranean parking structure of the federal courthouse. The concrete walls echoed with the low hum of vehicle engines and the sharp click of my heels against the pavement. I carried a single leather briefcase containing the decrypted ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the undeniable proof of their generational rot. I rounded the corner toward the secure elevator banks and stopped. They were waiting for me. Trent Page and Beatrice stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a physical barricade in front of the heavy steel doors leading to the courthouse entrance. The ambient light of the parking garage cast harsh, unforgiving shadows across their faces. They no longer looked like the untouchable elite of the city. Trent's custom suit looked rumpled, his eyes bloodshot and darting frantically. Paige was gripping her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were stark white, her usual manicured poise replaced by raw, trembling anxiety. Beatrice, however, refused to drop the facade. She stood perfectly upright, her chin tilted in that familiar angle of absolute disdain. As I approached, she stepped forward, effectively closing the gap and forcing me to halt or physically collide with her. "You are making a monumental mistake, Kendra," Beatrice stated, her voice echoing off the concrete pillars. Her tone was completely devoid of the theatrical panic she had utilized in my firm's lobby. This was the cold, calculating matriarch who had spent decades burying anyone who dared to challenge her family's dominance. I tightened my grip on my briefcase and met her stare with absolute indifference. "Move aside, Beatrice. I have a scheduled appointment with a federal prosecutor, and you are obstructing my path." Trent stepped up beside his mother, his jaw working furiously. "You owe me, Kendra. I gave you a life you never could have afforded on your own. You are going to walk in there and tell them those ledgers were fabricated by an angry ex-wife. You are going to claim you had a mental breakdown." I did not even look at him. My silence infuriated him further, but Beatrice held up a single manicured hand to silence her son. She leaned in close to me, her expensive perfume clashing with the stale air of the parking garage. "You do not understand how this city operates," Beatrice snarled, dropping the polite veneer completely. "We built the infrastructure of this town. We fund the campaigns. We sit on the boards. We have absolute ironclad connections with the judges in this jurisdiction. For 30 years, I have made problems exactly like you disappear with a single phone call." She took another step forward, attempting to force me to retreat. I held my ground. "You will walk into that grand jury room, and you will plead the fifth," Beatrice commanded, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "You will refuse to testify. If you speak a single word against my son, I will personally ensure that every door in the financial sector is permanently slammed in your face. I will ruin your reputation so thoroughly that you will never work in this state again. You will be penniless, disgraced, and completely eradicated." I stood perfectly still, absorbing the full weight of her arrogant threat. She truly believed her own mythology. She believed her wealth acted as an impenetrable shield against the laws of reality. I looked at Paige, who was visibly trembling. I looked at Trent, whose desperate eyes betrayed his sheer terror. Finally, I locked eyes with Beatrice. The corners of my mouth lifted in a sharp, unforgiving smile. I stepped forward, forcing Beatrice to break her stance and step aside or be knocked off balance. As I moved right through the center of their barricade, I turned my head slightly, my voice ringing with total, unyielding authority. "Your connections are local, Beatrice," I stated clearly, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls. "You bought municipal judges and local zoning commissioners. You intimidated city officials. But this is not a local dispute." I pressed the call button for the secure elevator. "This is a federal RICO case." I continued, turning to face them as the elevator mechanisms whirred to life. "The Department of Justice does not care about your country club donations. They do not care about your local influence. And those ironclad connections you are so proud of, they are the exact same people who just spent the last 48 hours sitting in federal interrogation rooms." The color completely drained from Beatrice's face. Trent took a stumbling step backward, his breath catching in his throat. "Every single one of your allies has already flipped on you to save themselves. I delivered the final crushing blow. They traded your son's freedom for federal immunity. You have absolutely nothing left." The heavy steel doors of the elevator slid open behind me. I stepped backward into the car, keeping my eyes locked on the terrified remnants of Trent's family. "See you inside." The doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of Beatrice's stunned, horrified expression and carrying me upward to finish the job. The heavy steel doors of the elevator sealed shut, leaving the parking garage and the shattered remains of Trent's family behind me. I walked into the grand jury room and laid out every piece of forensic evidence I had gathered over the past 3 years. I did not hesitate. I did not falter. 3 weeks later, the silence from Trent's camp was finally broken. I was at my desk when the firm's receptionist transferred a call from Vance Sterling. Vance was Trent's newly retained defense attorney, a high-priced, morally bankrupt shark known for making witnesses suddenly recant their testimonies. His voice dripped with artificial warmth as he requested a private off-the-record settlement dinner before the trial officially commenced. They believed I was breaking. Vance smoothly implied that the federal pressure was getting to be too much for a civilian like me, and that Trent was willing to offer a generous olive branch to save us all the public embarrassment of a trial. I agreed to the dinner. I knew exactly what they were trying to do, and I needed them to put their arrogance in writing. The meeting took place at the Oak and Anchor, a hyper-exclusive private club downtown where the city's elite went to conduct business away from prying eyes. The air was thick with the scent of aged scotch and expensive leather. I was escorted to a secluded private dining room in the back, shielded by heavy velvet curtains. Trent sat at the head of the mahogany table, swirling a glass of amber liquid. The terror I had seen in the courthouse parking lot was entirely gone, replaced by a smug, manufactured confidence. Paige sat beside him, wearing a cocktail dress that cost more than my first car, sipping a martini with practiced boredom. Beatrice anchored the opposite side, her posture rigid, her eyes cold and predatory. Vance Sterling stood near the window, adjusting his silk tie. They looked at me not as a threat but as a nuisance they were finally paying to exterminate. "Have a seat," Kendra Trent commanded, gesturing lazily to the empty chair opposite him. "I am glad you finally came to your senses. We all know you are completely out of your depth here. The federal government is just using you. When this goes to trial, they will chew you up and throw you away." I did not sit. I remained standing, resting my hands lightly on the back of the leather chair. Vance stepped forward, pulling a thick, legal-sized folder from his briefcase. He slid it precisely across the polished mahogany until it stopped directly in front of me. Alongside it, he placed a heavy gold fountain pen. "This is a comprehensive non-disclosure and settlement agreement," Vance said, his tone slick and condescending. "My client is offering a highly lucrative way out of this mess. We recognize that you have been under a tremendous amount of stress, Kendra. We are offering you a fresh start." Paige let out a quiet, mocking laugh, trailing her manicured finger around the rim of her glass. "You should be thanking us," she sneered. "You get to walk away from a fight you could never win, and you get to do it with a fat bank account. It is honestly more than you deserve." Beatrice leaned forward, her heavy diamond necklace catching the dim light of the chandelier. "Do not overthink this, Kendra," she warned, her voice a low, lethal hum. "This is the last lifeboat leaving a sinking ship. You take this deal or you drown. You were never one of us, and you never will be. Take the money and crawl back to whatever mediocre life you came from." Trent stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a look of absolute triumph. He pointed to the final page of the document. "Sign it!" Trent ordered, his voice dripping with absolute authority. "Sign it? Take the 2 million and disappear." The room fell dead silent. They watched me like predators watching a wounded animal finally succumb to exhaustion. They truly believed they had won. They believed that money was the ultimate equalizer, the universal solvent that could wash away federal indictments and forensic audits. I reached out and picked up the gold pen. Trent's smirk widened. Paige took a victorious sip of her martini. Beatrice relaxed her shoulders, settling back into her chair with a satisfied exhale. I flipped to the back page of the document, letting my eyes skim over the dense legal jargon and the final settlement figures. I tapped the tip of the pen against the thick parchment paper, the rhythmic clicking sound echoing in the quiet wood-paneled room. 2 million, I said softly, looking up to meet Trent's eyes. That is generous. It is business, Trent replied smoothly, raising his glass in a mock toast. Consider it severance. I lowered the pen, setting it deliberately beside the unsigned contract. I kept my gaze locked on Trent, watching his smug expression begin to freeze. It is generous, I continued, my voice dropping to a razor-sharp whisper that commanded the entire room. But there is a problem. Vance frowned, taking a half-step forward. The terms are non-negotiable, Kendra. I did not look at the lawyer. I leaned across the mahogany table, resting my weight on my palms, bringing myself closer to Trent, Paige, and Beatrice. The problem is not the amount, I stated clearly. The problem is the routing number listed on page 14 for the wire transfer. I recognize this sequence. Trent's hand stopped midair. The amber liquid in his glass trembled. This money, I said, my voice echoing off the walls, is drawn directly from the Cayman Island offshore account you swore under oath didn't exist. For a fraction of a second, the immaculate facade of the oak and anchor private dining room shattered. Vance Sterling's hand froze entirely on the knot of his silk tie. Paige's martini glass hovered inches from her lips, the liquid inside sloshing violently. But Trent, driven by pure, unfiltered narcissism, quickly rebooted his reality. He forced a harsh, barking laugh that bounced off the heavy mahogany walls. He slammed his Scotch glass onto the table, the crystal thudding aggressively against the polished wood. "Prove it," Trent spat, leaning back in his chair and spreading his arms in a gesture of absolute manufactured invincibility. "You are bluffing. You are just a glorified accountant playing dress-up. You have no subpoena power. You have no badge. You are a nobody, Kendra. You are a bitter, discarded ex-wife trying to extract revenge because you simply could not keep up with my lifestyle." He sneered, pointing a rigid finger at the settlement document resting between us. "That routing number is a standard corporate holding account. Your little task force has nothing but circumstantial garbage. If you had real proof, the federal agents would have raided my corporate offices weeks ago instead of sending you to whine at a dinner table. You think you can walk into my club, sit at my table, and dictate terms to me. I own the people who sign your paychecks." Beatrice slammed her hand flat against the table. The sudden sharp noise made Paige physically jump in her seat. Beatrice did not look at her son. Her venomous glare was fixed entirely on me. She saw the precise danger Trent was too arrogant to acknowledge, but her default mechanism was always brute force and intimidation. Her face mottled with a dark, furious red, the veins in her neck standing out in stark relief against her pearl choker. "Enough of this ridiculous posturing," Beatrice commanded, her voice vibrating with barely restrained fury. "You will pick up that pen, Kendra. You will sign your name on the dotted line, and you will walk out of this club with $2 million. If you say another word about offshore accounts, I will personally see to it that you face countersuits for defamation, extortion, and corporate espionage. You will rot in a concrete cell while we ruin whatever is left of your pathetic career." Vance Sterling finally found his voice, stepping forward to tap the heavy gold fountain pen against the table. He adjusted his suit jacket, pasting on a slick, diplomatic smile. "Kendra, as an officer of the court, let me be perfectly clear," Vance said, his tone dripping with oily persistence. "What you are alleging is a severe federal crime. If you leave this room and repeat these completely baseless accusations, we will bury you in civil litigation. You will spend the rest of your natural life tied up in grueling depositions. The federal government will abandon you the minute their case gets complicated. We have the capital to drag this out for a decade. Take the money. Sign the non-disclosure agreement. Go start a new life. I did not flinch. I did not blink. For years I had shrunk under the weight of this family's crushing expectations. I had allowed Trent to make me feel small and Beatrice to make me feel entirely inadequate. But standing here now, armed with irrefutable financial data, they looked remarkably fragile. They were not untouchable titans of industry. They were common criminals in very expensive suits. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit in the deeply uncomfortable reality of my absolute calm. They were waiting for me to crack, to show a single sign of weakness, to reach for the gold pen and surrender to their wealth. I looked down at the settlement document. It was 5 pages of dense legal text designed to buy my silence and erase my entire existence. I noted with profound satisfaction that the document was already fully executed on their end. Trent's arrogant, sweeping signature dominated the bottom of the final page. Beatrice had co-signed on behalf of the holding company. Vance had stamped and notarized it. They had laid the trap, fully expecting me to step blindly into it. I looked at the gold pen resting on the heavy parchment. I looked at the 4 faces staring back at me. Trent's arrogant smirk, Paige's quiet terror, Vance's sleazy persistence, Beatrice's lethal, unblinking glare. I reached out, but I did not grab the pen. I placed my index finger on the gold barrel and slowly, deliberately rolled it away from the document. It clattered softly against Vance's leather briefcase. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Trent," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the thick tension in the room. "I am just an auditor. I balance ledgers. I trace complex wire transfers. I read the fine print." I flattened my hands on the table and locked eyes with my ex-husband. "But I did not come here tonight to negotiate." I stated, my tone dropping to a razor-sharp register that commanded the entire room. "I did not come here to take your money, or listen to your mother's empty threats, or entertain your sleazy lawyer." I picked up the executed settlement agreement, holding it by the corner, as if it were physically contaminated. "I came here to verify your signatures on these settlement documents." Trent's smirk vanished entirely. The manufactured confidence drained from his face, replaced by a sudden sickening realization. He glanced down at the empty space on the table, then up at me, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "What are you talking about?" Trent demanded, his voice suddenly lacking any authority. I reached into my tailored blazer pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was already glowing brightly, displaying an active, highly encrypted audio transmission app. A small red recording icon pulsed steadily in the top right corner. Because I said tapping the screen once to lock and transmit the file directly to the federal prosecutor's secure server, signing a legal document, utilizing hidden offshore funds to bribe a federal witness, is the final predicate act needed for a RICO charge. Trent stared at the glowing screen of my phone as if it were a live grenade. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly white. His hand, which had been reaching for the Scotch glass, jerked backward. He scrambled out of his chair, stumbling over the heavy wooden legs, desperately trying to put physical space between himself and the signed settlement agreement resting on the mahogany table. Vance Sterling reacted with the pure, unadulterated self-preservation of a seasoned defense attorney. The moment the acronym RICO left my lips, his slick demeanor vanished. He snatched his briefcase off the floor, took 3 rapid steps backward, and raised both of his hands squarely in the air. "I am stepping away from the table," Vance announced, his voice tight and panicked. "I have zero knowledge of the origin of those funds. My clients assured me that account was fully vetted and domestically held. I am formally withdrawing my representation of Trent and Beatrice Sterling, effective immediately." "Coward!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking under the sudden immense strain. She slammed both fists onto the table, rattling the crystal glasses. "Get back here and do your job. We pay you a fortune to handle garbage like this." But Vance was already backing toward the corner of the room, shaking his head frantically. "You do not understand." Beatrice Trent choked out, his chest heaving as panic finally consumed him. He pointed a trembling finger at the document. "We just signed it. We just executed a bribe using the Cayman funds. It is a trap. She set a trap. Paige stood up, her expensive cocktail dress suddenly looking absurdly out of place. She gripped her martini glass so tightly the stem threatened to snap. You cannot do this, Kendra. You are nothing. We will destroy you. I slid my phone into my pocket, keeping my eyes locked on the terrified remnants of their dynasty. I did not have to say another word. The heavy brass-studded double doors of the private dining room did not just swing open, they were violently breached. The heavy wood slammed against the interior walls with a deafening crash that shook the vintage light fixtures. A dozen federal agents flooded into the opulent room. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision. They wore dark tactical gear with heavy Kevlar vests emblazoned with bold, bright yellow FBI lettering across the back and chest. They carried specialized tactical rifles fanning out instantly to secure the perimeter blocking the exits and surrounding the mahogany table. The sudden intrusion of federal force into the hyper-exclusive Oak and Anchor Club was jarring. The elite sanctuary had been violated, transformed in a matter of seconds into an active crime scene. Trent threw his hands over his head, sinking to his knees on the Persian rug without a single agent touching him. Beatrice remained frozen in her chair, her jaw hanging open, her eyes darting frantically between the armed agents as her brain completely failed to process the reality of her empire collapsing. Then the final figure stepped through the breached doorway. It was DeAndre. He was not wearing tactical gear. He wore a masterfully tailored midnight blue formal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. He walked with an aura of absolute unwavering authority, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor before stepping onto the rug. He looked directly at me and gave a single respectful nod. I nodded back. Paige dropped her martini glass. The crystal shattered against the floor, splashing premium vodka across her designer shoes, but she did not even flinch. She stared at her husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated relief, completely misinterpreting the entire situation. DeAndre Page screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the walls. What are you doing here? Tell these people to back off right now. Tell them who you are. Tell them to put their weapons down. We are your family. DeAndre stopped at the head of the table. He did not rush to comfort his wife. He did not look at her with an ounce of affection or reassurance. He stood perfectly straight, surveying the broken family before him, with the clinical detachment of an executioner examining his work. Paige took a step toward him, her hands reaching out desperately. DeAndre, please. Kendra is trying to frame us. You have to fix this. Use your badge. Use your connections. Make them leave. DeAndre looked down at the settlement agreement resting on the table. He reached out, picking up the document by its edges and quickly scanned the signatures and the routing numbers. He placed it inside a clear plastic evidence bag held open by one of the tactical agents standing beside him. Only then did he turn his gaze to Paige. His eyes were completely void of the warmth he had faked during all those miserable Sunday family dinners. I am not here to fix this, Paige. DeAndre stated, his voice resonating with cold, undeniable power. I am here to finish it. Paige froze, her hands dropping awkwardly to her sides. What are you talking about? You are my husband. DeAndre shook his head slowly, his expression hardening into stone. I am the lead prosecutor for the federal task force investigating your family. I have been building this case since the day I met you. Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest. Trent squeezed his eyes shut, his forehead resting against the floor. Paige looked as though she had been physically struck, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. DeAndre turned his attention to Trent and Beatrice, projecting his voice so every word landed like a physical blow. And Kendra is not just a witness. DeAndre continued, gesturing toward me where I stood at the end of the table. She is an officially registered FBI whistleblower. She handed us the exact blueprint to your entire criminal enterprise 18 months ago. We have tracked every dollar. We have monitored every account. We have listened to every threat. DeAndre leaned slightly across the table, locking eyes with Trent. You did not invite her to a settlement dinner, Trent. DeAndre delivered the final devastating truth. You invited her to a sting operation. DeAndre's final word hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the reality of the sting operation completely shattered the room. The illusion of Trent's invincibility evaporated instantly. His survival instinct kicked in raw and frantic. Trent lunged backward, shoving his heavy mahogany chair away so violently it tipped over and crashed against the floorboards. He spun toward the side service door, abandoning his mother, his sister, and his millions in a desperate bid for freedom. He did not make it 3 steps. 2 tactical agents intercepted his flight path with brutal synchronized efficiency. One grabbed the collar of his custom suit jacket, yanking his momentum backward. The second agent swept his legs. Trent hit the expensive Persian rug with a breathless, heavy thud. A tactical boot planted firmly between his shoulder blades, pinning him flat against the floor. The sound of steel handcuffs ratcheting tight echoed sharply across the quiet wood-paneled room. Beatrice scrambled backward out of her chair, her composure entirely obliterated. She pressed her back against the velvet curtains, her manicured hands flying to her throat to clutch her heavy diamond and pearl necklace. The cold, calculating matriarch who had dictated the social and financial currents of the city for 3 decades was gone, replaced by a frantic, terrified woman desperate to save herself. "I am a victim here!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking as 2 agents stepped forward to secure her wrists. "I knew nothing about his offshore accounts. I am a respected member of this community. I sit on the hospital board. Do not touch me." Her protests fell on completely deaf ears. The agents secured her wrists with clinical precision, ignoring her frantic demands for a lawyer. The chaos of the takedown spilled out into the opulent hallway of the Oak and Anchor. Through the wide-open double doors, a secondary squad of federal agents marched another prisoner toward the secure exit elevators. It was Sienna. She wore a rumpled designer blazer and heavy steel handcuffs, her usually immaculate makeup entirely smeared down her cheeks from crying. As she was paraded past the open doors of our private dining room, she caught sight of Trent pinned to the floor. She stopped walking, planting her feet so firmly the agent escorting her had to halt. "He made me do it!" Sienna screamed, her voice bordering on hysterical as she pointed her cuffed hands toward the floor. "Trent forced me to falsify those ledgers. He threatened to ruin my career. I told the feds everything, Trent. I gave them the hard drives. I gave them the encrypted passwords. Everything." An agent nudged her forward and Sienna disappeared down the corridor, her sobs echoing off the marble walls. She had delivered the final undeniable nail into his coffin. DeAndre did not flinch at the noise. He remained a portrait of absolute unyielding calm amidst the wreckage of his in-laws' empire. He pulled a folded federal warrant from the interior pocket of his tailored suit and stepped over to where Trent lay gasping against the carpet. "Trenton Sterling." DeAndre began, his voice projecting with the absolute legal authority of the Department of Justice. "You are under arrest. The federal grand jury has returned a true bill. You are being formally charged with wire fraud, international money laundering, smuggling, and witness intimidation." Trent writhed weakly against the agent's grip, his breath hitching in his chest. DeAndre paused, letting the sheer crushing weight of a federal RICO indictment settle over the room. Paige stood trembling near the head of the table. Her cocktail dress looked absurd amidst the tactical vests and federal badges. She reached out toward her husband, tears completely ruining her mascara, her hands shaking violently. "DeAndre, please," Paige sobbed, taking a tentative step forward. "I am your wife. You cannot let them do this to me. I had nothing to do with his business. I am completely innocent. Tell them to let me go home." DeAndre turned his head slowly. The look he gave her was entirely devoid of affection or matrimony. It was the icy, calculated gaze of a prosecutor examining a hostile target. He did not see a wife. He saw a co-conspirator. "We tracked the IP addresses originating from your personal laptop," Paige DeAndre stated coldly, his words slicing through her desperate pleas. "We traced the offshore shell companies directly to the philanthropic foundation that you and your mother currently manage. You used charity galas to launder stolen capital." He signaled to the remaining agents standing near the doorway. "Paige Sterling and Beatrice Sterling, you are both formally indicted for criminal conspiracy and federal cyber fraud," DeAndre commanded. "Take them into custody." The agents moved in, ignoring Paige's hysterical screams and Beatrice's furious, panicked threats. They hauled both women out of the dining room, their voices fading down the elegant hallway until they were completely gone. I remained standing at the table, my hands resting lightly on the polished mahogany. I looked down at Trent. His expensive suit was torn at the shoulder seam. His face was pressed hard into the carpet fibers, red, sweaty, and slick with tears of absolute defeat. The illusion of his superiority had been violently shattered. He strained against the agent's knee, lifting his head just enough to look up at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with complete devastation. He looked at the ledgers in my hand, at DeAndre standing watch, and finally at me. Why? Trent choked out his voice, a pathetic, raspy whisper that barely carried over the sound of the agents securing the room. Why didn't you just stay the quiet, boring wife? I walked slowly around the heavy wooden table, the sharp, deliberate click of my heels cutting through his heavy breathing. I stopped directly in front of him. I crouched down, bringing my face level with his, ensuring I was the absolute last thing he saw before the federal transport dragged him away to a concrete cell. Because boring numbers, girls, I said softly, my voice carrying the weight of 3 years of absolute unforgiving patience, know exactly how to calculate a downfall. The heavy mahogany doors of the Oak and Anchor Club faded into the sterile, unforgiving oak of the federal courthouse. 1 year later, the gavel fell for the final time. There were no backroom deals to save them, no high-priced attorneys left to buy their freedom, and no local judges willing to risk their own careers for a ruined dynasty. Trent stood before the federal judge, stripped of his bespoke suits, and his arrogant smirk wearing the bright orange jumpsuit of a federal inmate. The judge handed down a staggering 20-year sentence without the possibility of early parole for wire fraud, international money laundering, smuggling, and witness intimidation. Trent did not look back as the bailiffs led him away in shackles. His shoulders were slumped, his unearned confidence completely and permanently eradicated. Sienna stood at the same podium hours later. Despite flipping on the family and handing over the encrypted hard drives, her active participation in fabricating the ledgers earned her a swift, non-negotiable 7-year sentence. Her theatrical tears in the courtroom garnered absolutely zero sympathy from the bench. The criminal convictions triggered a catastrophic financial avalanche. The Department of Justice seized every asset tied to the Sterling enterprise. The offshore accounts were permanently frozen, the corporate holding companies were dissolved, and the sprawling suburban estates were foreclosed upon and liquidated. Beatrice and Paige were stripped of the illicit wealth that had defined their entire existence. Today, the former matriarch and her golden daughter share a cramped, run-down 2-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of the city. The paint on their walls is peeling, and the ambient hum of a failing refrigerator has replaced the quiet clinking of crystal glasses. Their country club memberships were publicly and immediately revoked. The high society friends they had bought, bribed, and bullied for decades completely shunned them, severing all contact the moment the federal indictments went public. They were rendered entirely invisible ghosts haunting the edges of a city they once claimed to own. DeAndre did not hesitate to extract himself from the wreckage. He filed for divorce the morning after the sting operation at the private club. Paige attempted to fight him in court, desperately clinging to his status to salvage her own, but her indictment as a co-conspirator left her with absolutely no leverage. DeAndre severed the tie, cleanly keeping full custody of his peace of mind, his untarnished reputation, and his stellar career. Unburdened by their toxic web, he continues to dismantle corrupt syndicates with the same surgical precision he used to take down his in-laws. My reality shifted from the quiet, suffocating suburbs to the relentless electric pulse of Manhattan. I stood at the head of a sprawling, glass-walled boardroom on the 65th floor of a massive Wall Street skyscraper. I smoothed the lapels of my flawless tailored navy blazer, looking out over the panoramic view of the New York City skyline. The transition was not just geographic, it was a complete professional metamorphosis. I had not just survived the Sterling family's attempt to bury me, I had weaponized their downfall. The global financial firm that recruited me did not see a liability, they saw a weapon. Yesterday, I was officially promoted to Global Director of Forensic Investigations. I now command an entire division of elite auditors, tearing down corrupt conglomerates and exposing financial rot on an international scale. A soft chime broke the quiet hum of the empty boardroom. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, glancing at the glowing screen. It was a secure notification from my banking institution. The deposit had just cleared. As an officially registered whistleblower, federal law mandated that I receive a percentage of the capital recovered from the criminal enterprise I helped dismantle. The SEC Whistleblower Reward Program had officially finalized the payout. I stared at the string of numbers on the screen. It was a massive 8-figure deposit, a staggering, life-altering sum, completely legitimate, fully taxed, and entirely mine. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket, turning my gaze back to the sprawling concrete jungle below. The reflection in the glass showed a woman who had finally stepped entirely out of the shadows, free from the weight of a family that had demanded my silence. They told me I was nothing but a calculator. They were right. I calculated their sins, I calculated their hubris, and in the end, I calculated their absolute ruin. The most profound lesson from this narrative is that blood does not automatically dictate loyalty, and family is sometimes the first to underestimate your true value. When the people expected to protect and champion you instead choose betrayal or indifference, it forces a devastating but necessary awakening. True security and self-worth cannot be inherited or granted by others. They must be fiercely cultivated from within. Reclaiming your power means stepping out of the shadow of toxic expectations and building a life anchored in your own authentic success. Have you ever had to redefine your worth after a betrayal? Share your story in the comments below.